Welcome to Season 9 of Purposeful Empathy, a show dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who believe the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Today's episode is brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today, I am joined by Dr. Elizabeth Segal, who is a professor in the School of Social Work at Arizona State University, where she teaches courses primarily focused on social welfare policy. Her study of public policy included a year as a congressional fellow in Washington, D.C., through the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Elizabeth's current research is on interpersonal and social empathy, which involves using empathic insight to create better social welfare policies and programs. Her work includes development of instruments to measure people's inclinations towards interpersonal and social empathy, things we're going to unpack through this conversation. Welcome to the show, Elizabeth.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
It's great to have you, and I look forward to this conversation. I don't know much about you and what got you to this path of empathy and social empathy. So would you mind sharing with our listeners and viewers a little bit about yourself?
Sure. As you mentioned, I'm a professor in the School of Social Work. So I'm a social worker by training, and then went back to get my PhD to do research. And my area, as you mentioned, also is on social welfare policy, the public policies that affect our social interactions, our well-being. So I've been teaching courses on social welfare policy actually every year of my career. It's my thing. And over the years, I noticed something that was striking to me that I didn't understand. And that was that when I taught public policy and trying to understand it from what if you were in this situation, which is an empathic insight, because I found that that's the best way to teach it. I had students who got it, like snapped on it, understood racial issues, class issues, what it was like to grow up poor, some of them even who hadn't been poor growing up. But then I'd have students who didn't get it. And I got to know them, and they were very nice people, and they were caring, and they were going to make good social workers, but completely missed how public policy impacted people they didn't know in a personal way. And that led me on this journey. I coined the term social empathy as I was doing the work, but I didn't know, I thought it might be a tolerance issue and understanding diversity. So I started on lots of different things. And I had a sabbatical in 2008. I decided I was going to write about social empathy, except that I didn't really know what I meant by it, but I had this intuitive almost feeling about it. So I started to do the research and actually realized that I was looking at empathy, which my training as a social worker was much more macro. So while I had psychology and did learn about therapeutic interventions on the personal level, that wasn't my expertise anymore. So I was bamboozled by all this literature on empathy. And I had a colleague who was also on sabbatical, who we would have lunch once a week to keep each other on track. And she was much more in that area. And I said, oh, I'm really having trouble with this. So she said, and it was Karen Gertis, who I've co-authored with greatly on this, said, oh, well, I'll look at it. I've got time and I'll get back to you before, I'll talk to you next week. Well, she called me in a few days, like totally excited, and said, oh my gosh, there's all this cognitive neuroscience research out there on empathy that's brand new. This was really just years in the making. And all this, just everything about it. She said, I'm so excited. I said, will you work with me on it? So that's how we started, where Karen became my Sherpa through so through the psychology and the cognitive neuroscience of empathy. And then I was continually developing it and connecting it to how to make it more macro and help people understand things about people they didn't know, people who weren't like them. And that's how it started.
And I can't wait to talk about how social empathy and the cognitive neuroscience of empathy actually can inform good social policy where more people can benefit from the fruits of the world. But let's start with some of the basics. So thanks for sharing that background. That's so fascinating. And I can imagine your friend calling saying, "Oh my gosh, we really have something here," because I feel the same enthusiasm as you might imagine. So you've coined this term social empathy. Can you explain what it means and why it's so important?
So, social empathy is using empathic skills to understand, and we can talk more about what those are. And I know you're familiar, and different people construct it differently. I base it on the cognitive neuroscience, but taking those skills that we do with one-on-one or in a small group and apply it on a larger scale. So to groups that we don't know, groups that could be in other parts of the world, experiences we've never had, try to learn empathically about them, and then create public policies that address that, that use that in informing it. And I'll just say parenthetically that there's so many policies out there that are misguided, and people more and more over history, but throughout history, people making policies don't look like the people they make policies for. So there's a mismatch. And if you don't have empathy or social empathy, you're going to make bad policies, or at least policies that are nasty or at best just a misfit for the people who need them the most. And so that's what drove me. I mean, part of it is my study of social policy, that we miss the mark. Sometimes we hit the mark, and often we miss the mark.
I'm thinking what's happening these days is that there's been massive protests in Iran, where you have a group of leaders that are making social policy for half the population, and there's resistance. And now we're seeing like this has got to end, right? That's a good example.
And that's a great example, because that's not different than people in the streets in many other parts of the world, including our own countries, where they're saying, hey, you in power, you're telling me to do something that doesn't fit for me, isn't right, and actually is oppressive. And you're missing who I am. Now, either you're doing that on purpose, which then is a different reason to revolt because you're oppressing me, or you don't understand me. But either way, empathy is missing.
So, do you have any examples at the tips of your fingers or tongue, good social policies that actually embrace social empathy?
Oh yeah. Now my expertise is in the United States, so I apologize if I'm not as international or widespread. But my very first work in studying and wrote my dissertation was on the Social Security Act, which was passed in 1935 in the United States. It is probably still one of the longest standing examples of policymakers who used what they knew about poverty, about labor, and created a policy that would help those who are most disadvantaged or most at risk, particularly elderly, but poor elderly, poor single mothers, and created this policy. And in my research of it, the leader in the House of Representatives at the US and the leader in the US Senate were both men, but who had grown up poor and talked about their own experience. So they had built into it. I have oodles of other examples, just a small one also. Bobby Kennedy, before he was unfortunately assassinated, when he was running for president and visiting throughout the United States, went down into Appalachia, the poorest areas of white mountain, areas in southern Ohio and in Kentucky. And the people with him said he was moved to tears. And actually, he was at that point, I guess, attorney general. He was still his brother was still alive. And he came back to Washington and said, we have to do something. And that was the impetus behind building the food stamp program. Because, and here was a privileged member of government who certainly did not grow up poor, but was willing to be open and walk in the shoes of others. And he felt what they felt. He had the capacity to, which is another question about whether you have to have that ability. So he clearly had the ability and was moved so greatly, and then had the power to bring it back for policy. Those are just a couple examples. I've collected many of them over the years.
So in your expertise in this space. Would you say that over your lifetime you've seen public policy drifting away from the needs of the people in your country?
Actually, no, I think the opposite, but the struggle, the clash is what feels like we're not making progress.
Tell
That,
me more.
okay, so even besides recent, there have been incremental improvements. So for us, the Affordable Care Act, not having national medical care like you do in Canada, but was a huge progress and was built on it. So in fact, if I may, the Social Security Act, when it was passed, there were many who wanted to include medical care. But at that point, the president, Roosevelt, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, said, we're not going to get it passed if we put too much in it. And so we have to be careful about this, but soon we'll do that. Well, it took 30 more years and we passed Medicare and Medicaid, our more nationalized health insurance programs. And then it took how many more years from 1965 to 2010 to make it more comprehensive. And even then, the Affordable Care Act is got a long ways to go from my perspective, but it's a huge, so in healthcare alone, we've only made progress, but you got to live, decades to see the progress. And watching it in real time in recent years almost be destroyed, and yet it was saved, and now it's become even stronger. We've added new things under Biden that make it even stronger. That's one example. I think the abortion issue is complicated, but I think what we're seeing, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think we will keep moving in the direction of protecting women's choice. And that's another example that has moved the ball forward, so to speak, if I use that analogy. So
Right.
I'm cautiously I'm optimistic, but the struggle is difficult.
Right. I mean, a decade ago, would we have been convinced that gay marriage would have been as widespread, right?
That's
Another
a
example.
perfect example. In fact, I use it in my class. In fact, back in the early aughts, I was involved in a lot of gay rights policymaking here in the state of Arizona. And it was, an uphill climb. It looked impossible. If you had told me that it would move as quickly as it did, I would have said you're wrong. But what I didn't take into account, something we know about social empathy, is that being LGBTQ cuts across all families, races, religions, ages. And it moves so quickly, I believe, because as people came out, everyone knew someone, whether it's a celebrity, an athlete, a family member, a sibling. It just mushroomed because it was a real thing to people and they could empathically identify. And that's why I think it moves so quickly.
And that's why I think I have a bit of hope. And I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on this, about how quickly policy has to move to fight climate change, and how we're seeing massive weather disruptions. I mean, right now, as we're talking, Florida is being pummeled by a hurricane. Do you think that social empathy can advise climate change policy?
Very much so. I think we're already at the point where people should be seeing that it doesn't matter where we live, we're all in this together. I'm not sure that consciously enough people are there yet, but if they react the way that most people who are living through these crises, I mean, what did I just hear? This was once in a 1,000 year storm. You can't say that anymore because they're happening. I mean, I think enough people, that might be one of the similar to gay marriage, is that all of a sudden you can be as rich as you can be, but if your home is, in fact, many of the richest homes are on waterfront property, you're going to lose them. So this affects people across class, race, gender, age. It's what's really disturbing is that these manifestations are different in different parts of the country, but they're hitting everywhere, whether it's wildfires, drought, hurricanes, horrific rainstorms. I mean, these are flooding. This is happening all over.
Right. Now, you strike me as somebody who sees the power and potential of leveraging empathy and social empathy to create a better world, which is coming contrary to another book, which has a kind of very contrarian title called Against Empathy by Paul Bloom, a psychologist at Yale, I want to say, Princeton or
Yeah.
Yale. um his basic thesis is like empathy gets us into a lot of trouble because we care about the kid who's fallen down the well and we don't care about this other stuff. And I think he's kind of missing a big part of empathy because he's stuck on the affect part of
Right.
empathy. So could you just comment a little bit in terms of how you differ from him?
Well, so this goes to the components, and based on all of our work and the work that I really delved into with cognitive neuroscience. And from that, which we outlined in our book, Assessing Empathy, is that we see 5 components to interpersonal. Well, maybe now I could sort of jump in and explain interpersonal and social empathy a little bit too.
Sure.
So interpersonal empathy is between one, two small group, and social empathy I already talked about is the macro, more bigger scope. So based on cognitive neuroscience and looking at all the literature out there, we pull together the 5 components that make empathy, which sometimes are called just affective. Parts of it are affective, cognitive, emotional, and those 5 parts are together the full array of empathy. And it's we don't know how much. I think we, on any given day, we could be stronger in parts of it, but generally it's that initial unconscious, we feel something, that's that we are hardwired to mirror others and connect in that way. So that's the unconscious piece, affective response. And then there are 4 components that we actually learn and can be taught. A lot of those we learn from such a young age and intuitively pick up from our environment and our nurturers. But basically, those are a combination of the ability to step into someone else's shoes, which is perspective taking, but more important than that is important with that is being aware that, hey, I'm feeling what you're feeling and I'm hearing you and imagining as best I can what it's like. But whoa, I'm a separate person, so I don't get overwhelmed. So I know I have my own feelings and my own. So that's self-other awareness. And we can do this either from the affective unconscious or actually thinking about it, which is mentalizing. And then we do all that with one more component that is emotion regulation, which really regulates, which helps us. So if you're really, really happy or upset about something and I'm picking up on it, I have to not just, I want to share it with you. There's the general thought of empathy, but I need to make sure I don't get overwhelmed. So you're you, I'm me. I keep boundaries, and I have my emotional house in order that I can balance it. That's the full array of empathy. What Bloom, I think, does is picks pieces of empathy and they're not empathy. So he's looking at what I would call, and the literature calls, emotional contagion. So, we get all worried about the little boy who fell in the well, and we're not thinking about what caused it or whatever, but that's because we're caught up in the moment. And that can be a good thing. But when we step out of it from what we've learned, we need to understand I'm emotionally impacted right now, but I need to step back a little bit and think through how can I work, how does this help us or not help us? What can I do to further us in a better place? And I think he misses that. I think he ties up empathy purely as an emotion.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've written some stuff about it. I don't agree with him at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, neither do I, but I'm glad I asked.
Well, and I tend to think it's sensationalist, and I have the opportunity of blogging for Psychology Today, and so I talk about there's another book that came out about the dark side of empathy, which I think is exactly the same thing. And so my as catchy title as I can come up with is there's no such thing as dark empathy, just people with dark sides, and it's people who are dark and not necessarily bringing in the other pieces of empathy. And I'll just throw up in terms of social empathy, I take those components and macroize them, if there's no real word is that, but expand them so that we do the perspective taking through historical knowledge. So we understand groups and their experiences, and that history follows groups and is embedded in their beings. So we understand that and then walk in their shoes and try to understand their context. It's much more context focused because you're not there with them potentially.
Right. And if you wouldn't mind holding up your book before I hold up your next book, or the one that you wrote previously. There we go. Social Empathy. And we'll include a link for everybody who's interested to buy it. Fantastic. And then I'm
Thank you.
holding up this one, Assessing Empathy, which is a slightly more scholarly and research focused text. Today's episode was brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. You mentioned something along the lines of becoming more empathic or having a more empathic or socially empathic inclination. How do we do that? How can we become more socially empathic?
Okay, that's the $100 million question, not just 64,000. It's $100 million question. We have to learn it, and we have to be taught, and we have to practice. And one of the things that I found actually comforting reading how complicated the cognitive neuroscience and that now cognitive neuroscience has actually looked at the brain and seen the components and that the different spots. Generally, there's like 13 spots that the brain uses just for all those components that we know of. So it's so what that has helped me to understand is that this is complicated. This isn't easy. We shouldn't be down on ourselves like, oh, you don't care about others. You don't have any empathy. On a given day, knowing what we know about the neuroscience, you could be having a bad day. I could be having a bad day and I'm just not clicking in. So empathy is, so first in teaching it is letting people know it's difficult. It's not easy. You need to practice it. It's not always comfortable. So I try to start from there because I think we make it sound like it's everyone, and we throw it around. We throw the term around, meaning different things to different people, as if it's just an easy thing, and it's not. And in fact, in the research over the years, and I thought I was a pretty empathic person, and I, am a social worker, so aren't I by training empathic? No. And I discovered, particularly when it comes as a professional, when it comes to really setting, and we learn about setting boundaries, but really maintaining that self-other awareness and emotion regulation and taking care of myself, I wasn't so great at it. So I had a lot to learn. And that's, in fact, what we did by creating an instrument is trying to divide the components out so we can see what we need to work on. So for each one, so there's no one training for empathy. If I'm particularly bad at setting boundaries and being aware of my emotions and I get swept up in other people's, then I have to work on that. If I'm not particularly good at walking in the shoes of others, then I have to practice that. And there's ways, I mean, some of it is just being aware for me and those I work with, just being aware, oh, there are these parts of it. Am I doing these things? Already starts the training and teaching of empathy.
You just said something that was for me a very powerful aha moment, because we're hearing, compassion fatigue, empathy fatigue, people who are in the healing spaces or frontline healthcare workers, social workers, psychologists, they're constantly meeting the needs of their patients or their clients, and then they feel overwhelmed sometimes with the kind of aggregate trauma that they've kind of rubbed up against. And I've always seen it as, okay, very important to recharge your batteries and do some self-care. But what I've just heard for the first time, and I can look at myself in the mirror and hold myself accountable for this too, but you've given me a new appreciation. You just said that if you're thinking about yourself as an empathic person, that self-empathy piece is as important as the others, as part of your whole empathic self. That's fascinating.
And I think we make mistakes with thinking empathy is the outcome of action. So, oh, bleeding heart,
I'll
liberal,
make a
nice.
donation.
And that's not it. Empathy is the skill. What you do with it is separate. And sometimes you can be incredibly empathic and then say, okay, I'm not doing anything to help you. You need to do it yourself. Like, we don't have to take care of people per se. That may be an outcome, but that's one of many choices of outcomes. And I think we that's another issue I have with the way empathy is often used by others who write books. And that is that I think they're mixing up the choices we make of action with the skill of empathy. So for example, you may be working with we work with clients who need boundaries and say, I hear what you're saying. I really I understand, but you need to do your own work. And we're not going to do it for you. You have to do it yourself. And I think that's true in lots of ways. And that's why empathy sometimes gets muddled in a way that it is not the outcome. It is just a tool. And what we choose to do is the outcome.
That's fascinating. And I think that you're touching on something. The reason why I use the qualifier of purposeful empathy is, using empathy on purpose
Right.
for an outcome. And in a chapter where I describe, what I've learned about empathy over the years, I also include information about some of the barriers to empathy that we have to overcome as people. And a big part of that came out of this book, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about this. I was really fascinated to read that when you have a degree of power or privilege or wealth or resources, that makes a big difference in terms of your capacity or inclination to empathize. So could you share a little bit about that?
So I mentioned that the goal of social empathy is to basically get those who are in power to make policy to be empathic in their policy making. The problem is that power in and of itself is a barrier to empathy. And the reason for that is, well, there's several reasons. And some of them are good and some of them aren't so good. So typically people who are in power or get to powerful positions, if they attended to other people's needs and feelings too much, they wouldn't get there. They'd be overwhelmed and consumed. So running a bigger operation, running something that involves lots of people's emotions, potentially your workers, your employees, or your colleagues, or your constituents, your patients, when you have that many feelings going around and you have a task, it's better to be focused. So people in leadership, powerful positions do benefit from tamping down their empathy. That's because then they can get a task done. They don't fall into that one individual case and miss all the other people. Okay. The problem is that you're going to miss hearing the voices of those you aren't listening to, essentially. So and the biggest problem is that because that is a skill of power, it attracts people with lower empathy. So the research discovers if you are a person of high empathy and get to a leadership position, you use it well. You understand about emotion regulation and self-other awareness. You use it well. But the path there isn't as easy for someone who is empathic, who's strongly empathic. It is not built that way, the way that we create leadership and power positions. So that's the dilemma. And the other thing of it is that if you've always had power, which often is privilege, you're not even trained to look at people different than you because everything's going smoothly and you have this great life. So you don't look around you. Whereas if you are disadvantaged or if you are oppressed, you have to, first of all, you often have to be bicultural, so to speak, in the sense that you have to understand your life and then those in power because how they might affect you. So you mentioned the protests in Iran. What those who are in the streets are very well versed to the point of putting themselves at danger. They know it's dangerous, which means they've read those in power. They understand those in power. They understand how they operate and they understand what they need and how their peers and they operate. So they're bicultural empathically. Those in power may be totally clueless and just find this to be youthful anger, or it's not, they just don't get it and they don't want it, or it's not appropriate, so that's where, if you have power, you really, ironically, you need to work hard on your empathy, because you're at a disadvantage already than somebody who is less powerful.
It's so interesting because I think that's a really important message to leaders of corporations, leaders of nonprofits, leaders of public service, elected officials. The examples, of course, that come to mind of leaders who have kept their empathy, which will show our political stripes. But Bernie Sanders seems to me a perfect example of somebody who's
Yes.
attained power, but is staying grounded in social empathy. And with mixed results over the whole 8 years, but beautiful examples of empathy from Barack Obama. When we think about what happened in Sandy Hook and the way he expressed himself with the authenticity and vulnerability of a father, sharing his sorrow nationally over what was happening, those people have still kept in touch, I think.
Exactly. And I don't envy people. I mean, I've had moments where I've run things and been in power relative, and it's really hard when you have empathy, and to be, I don't envy the president of the United States who is visiting disaster areas and human disaster areas like mass shootings. I mean, that it's on your watch. And that if you have empathy, you really, really have to take care of your emotion regulation, because you're in a position where you might be able to make a difference, but you also are in a position where you feel it all. So I think those are I think those are terrific examples, and I watch for it when I elect people. I try to see, do they have a glimmer of it? You don't have to be the best at it, but if you have any at all, you're going to make, in my opinion, make better policy, because you're going to listen to the people who are impacted by that policy.
Yeah. And it's a coincidence. Today is, we're taping this on September 30th, which in Canada is the second annual Day of Truth and Reconciliation. So the idea is to wear orange shirts in recognition of what the Indigenous peoples in Canada have gone through the school system, the residential school system for 150 years. And I think this is an example of social empathy permeating the sort of
Yes.
the psyche of the nation, but also reaching the level of public policy where now it's kind of institutionalized empathy, right?
So I just this past few months wrote 2 pieces for the Social Empathy Psychology Today blog on truth and reconciliation. I have another colleague, he's done a lot of work on it, and we're good friends. And he had a piece come out recently, an academic piece, and I was like, I got to write about this from an empathy perspective. So actually, Anita, you were asking earlier about tools. I think what truth and reconciliation does is let people tell their stories. And that's a huge tool for moving empathy. So to make it a codified day is even more important, because what you're saying is, I hear what you've gone through, and I want to hear what you've gone through, both as victim and as perpetrator. And also to get the information out there. That's social empathy, learning about context, historical events. So I think on a macro level, truth and reconciliation, however, I mean, some of them are done, South Africa did it in a very formalized way, and Canada has more formalized, but even communities have used it very effectively. And I think that's a great tool for building empathy.
Right. So just a last question, and then I will ask my final question, which is always, purposeful empathy story. This has been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. Um, I just wonder if you have any thoughts on, how public displays like that or codified, acts could somehow also um, uh, turn into, there's a word I'm looking for, where you're displaying a solidarity, but you're just doing it to kind of tick a box. What's that word I'm looking for?
Performative.
Performative, exactly. So, at what point does something become performative, and how can we mitigate against it? Like, I even wonder, okay, should I be wearing my yellow shirt? But I'm watching videos of Indigenous people saying, you wearing them lets us feel that you care about our social justice. So then I feel, okay, I'm doing the right thing, but I don't want to be performative. So, thoughts?
Well, so performative isn't the end of the world at all, because the way we train our neural pathways is by sometimes our untrained bad neural pathways is to force ourselves to do things physically to learn them, even if we're not sure we believe it. The very classic example, working out a better, the New Year's resolutions. I'm going to lose weight and I'm going to work out more.
Yeah.
You are actually having to change your neural pathways. I've tried many times and it's difficult. And so, you fake it till you make it in a weird kind of way. Not even weird. I think this is where neuroscience helps us, is that I may not originally feel like, oh, I put on this special color or I'm going to this march, but I don't know. I don't think it. But doing it changes your brain pathways. And that's how you learn empathy. So, what we don't remember because we were children is how many times we were forced to do things to learn to be empathic. So, the classic I always think about when we're little is, you hit somebody and your parent said, one of your parents or an adult says, how would you feel if he hit you? And you're learning empathy. You're all of
Yeah.
a sudden being told, oh, what if that did happen to me? And I've seen children where they're shocked to realize it could happen to them. Like they're not aware yet of how their behaviors impact others and how others might feel. And then we see children come to that awareness. That's learning empathy. So on a macro level, I need to learn empathy about how climates affect. I may need to go to a march on climate change or watch a movie, which is incredibly powerful. I need to learn about the boarding schools and Indigenous children and what happened historically. And also from a social empathy perspective, what does it mean today? Just because it was someone's parent, grandparent, great grandparent, it affects families. We know that. When I was studying family therapy early in my social work training, at first I thought it was kind of hokey that what happened to a grandparent or a great grandparent carried through the family. But I learned about it and appreciated it and how powerful it is that even relatives you don't know because they passed away long before you were born have an impact on your life. Well, so too in terms of communities. And so I think things like recognition days, yes, for some people, they're only going to be performative, but it's a great place to start for others who are learning. And that performative can become habit, and that habit can become belief, and that belief leads to change.
Ah, so glad we asked that question. 100 or so episodes in, we've never had that conversation on this show. I'm so happy. Thank you for that. That is that. Thank you. So, with the last question of the episode, can you think of a time, Elizabeth, when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what it meant for you?
I thought about it, and I maybe I'm just too caught up in my macro brain. So I know that people have helped me greatly who understood me, but I couldn't come up with a compelling example. But the compelling example for me is public policy. And I had talked about Social Security, but there's something else in the United States that was, we call it the GI Bill. It was the Servicemen's Readjustment or some act or whatever. And it was for veterans returning from World War II. And my father was a veteran who fought in World War II. And that's a whole story and multiple books I want to write about his experience that I still, he told lots of stories and it really shaped who he was. And he was very, very aware that he grew up very poor and he didn't even wait to be drafted. He enlisted, but he was honest. He said, well, it sounded like the right war to enlist in, but really I couldn't find jobs, So, But the GI Bill changed his life drastically, and in two ways. One was buying a home that I was born in and grew up in my whole life, and that he could go to school, and become a professional, which he would never have been able to. And so his whole life was shaped by that certainly before I was born, but even before I understood. And he talked about it his whole life. And he talked about what a gift it was. And I think he imparted in me, I know he did. And my mother shared that because she felt very much that she also grew up poor. The government had been there to help during the Great Depression. And it's that understanding. So for me, the purposeful empathy was that my parents were so grateful to have been helped by a system, by a government that we often malign and we often say terrible things about. But for them, it was life changing in the most incredible way, and they passed it on to us. And I mean, I feel like I know what it was like to have gotten that GI Bill mortgage, when really, of course I didn't, because I wasn't born yet, but they passed it on to me. So that's, again, for me, it's more of a macro experience. But of course, that's what I write about. So it's in my head probably most powerfully.
That's a powerful story, and it also makes me think of what a game changer reparations could mean for
Yes.
your country.
Yes.
You know, imagine how it would change the psychological landscape at a macro level.
And ironically, the more I studied policy, this GI Bill, which has been touted as we appreciate our veterans who came back from World War II and we want to take care of them, it was really came out of failure in World War I, and that they did nothing for the veterans who returned, and they rebelled and they set, fire. They protested in the Capitol, and it was, I mean, so this wasn't warm-hearted and fuzzy. That's where social empathy isn't just doing good because, oh, it feels good and I'm so performative. No, it's very practical. It didn't work out. World War I was a disaster with returning veterans. How can we do this better? And they thought about it and created a policy. And even then, I don't think anyone thought it would be that big a policy. It was huge. It radically changed a generation that, for me, at my age, were my parents. And they passed it on.
I have loved every minute of this conversation, and I'm sure the listeners and viewers have experienced the same, really like some light bulb moment. So thank you for spending your morning, Elizabeth, with us on this show. I appreciate all the viewers and the listeners, and we'll see you next week at Purposeful Empathy.
And Anita, thank you for the work you do, because this is really important, and talking about it. And that's the start for people who are just learning empathy, but also people who have great, strong empathy. We need to hear it. So thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, in solidarity. Have a great day, everyone. What if you had access to your own council of coaches to help you break free of your thinking clutter, make that important decision, and liberate you from whatever is holding you back? At Grand Huron International, you get to choose the coach of your choice anytime from anywhere. Visit grandhuroninternational.ca and harness the power of on-demand coaching today.